The rain had stopped. The air hung heavy with grief at St. Mary's Cemetery. In the small town of Maplewood, Pennsylvania, Margaret Ellison, 78, stood by her husband Robert's grave. Her trembling hands clutched a single white rose. The crowd of mourners, neighbors, old friends, distant relatives began to disperse, their black umbrellas folded like wilting flowers. Robert, a retired schoolteacher and Vietnam veteran, had been the heart of this community. His passing at 80 left a void no one could fill. But then, a low, guttural growl pierced the silence. All eyes turned to Rusty, Robert's loyal German shepherd. Tethered to a nearby tree, his hackles were raised, his eyes locked on the freshly turned earth of Robert's grave. Margaret froze. Rusty yanked free from his leash, charged toward the casket now 6 feet under, and began to dig. Furiously, claws tearing at the dirt, a desperate whine escaping his throat. The mourners gasped. "Margaret, stop him!" cried her sister Clara. But Margaret couldn't move. Something about Rusty's determination held her rooted. This wasn't just a dog grieving. It was something more. Rusty had been Robert's shadow for a decade, sleeping at his bedside during his final days. What did he know that they didn't? The cemetery groundskeeper, a gruff man named Tom, grabbed a shovel to pull Rusty away. But the dog snapped, baring his teeth. The crowd whispered nervously. Was this madness? Or was Rusty trying to tell them something? Margaret's heart pounded. She remembered Robert's last words, whispered weakly. "Rusty knows, Maggie. He always knows. What could a dog possibly know about a grave?" The question gripped every mourner like a vice. As Rusty's digging grew frantic, clumps of earth flying, Margaret stepped forward. Her voice shook. "Let him be." The crowd fell silent, their eyes locked on the dog. Tearing into the ground, this wasn't just a funeral anymore. It was the beginning of a mystery that would unravel secrets Robert had carried to his grave and beyond. Margaret's knees ached as she stood by the grave. The damp chill seeped through her coat. At 78, she'd buried too many. Her parents, her brother, now Robert. But this moment, it felt different, surreal. Rusty's relentless digging drew murmurs from the crowd, their faces a mix of shock and unease. Clara tugged at Margaret's sleeve. "This isn't right, Maggie," she whispered. "People are staring." Margaret ignored her. Rusty's brown eyes, wild with purpose, reminded her of Robert's stubborn streak. The dog had been a gift from Robert 10 years ago, a rescue pup who'd bonded with him instantly. They'd been inseparable. Robert teaching Rusty tricks, Rusty trailing him on morning walks through Maplewood's quiet streets. Even in Robert's final months, as cancer stole his strength, Rusty never left his side. The groundskeeper, Tom, hesitated, shovel in hand. "Mrs. Ellison, I can't let this go on. It's disrespectful." "Disrespectful?" Margaret snapped, surprising herself. "That dog loved Robert more than most people here. If he's digging, there's a reason." Her voice cracked, but her resolve held firm. She trusted Robert's instincts for 50 years of marriage. Now she'd trust his dog. The mourners shifted uneasily. Some, like old Mr. Jenkins from the hardware store, nodded in quiet agreement. Others, like Clara, whispered about making a scene. But no one left. The air buzzed with curiosity. What was Rusty after? Tom sighed and stepped back, muttering about crazy old folks and their pets. Rusty's paws churned the earth, revealing the wooden edge of the casket. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Margaret's heart raced. She hadn't expected this. Was Rusty just grieving, or was there something in that grave they weren't meant to see? She thought back to Robert's final days. He'd been restless, muttering about things left undone. She chalked it up to painkillers. But now doubt crept in. Robert had always been a man of secrets. Small ones, like hiding lottery wins to surprise her with gifts. Or bigger ones, like the stories he never told about Vietnam. Had he left something behind, buried with him? As Rusty's digging exposed more of the casket, Margaret made a decision. "Tom," she said, her voice steady now. "Get another shovel, we're opening it." The crowd froze. Clara gasped. "Maggie, you can't." But Margaret's eyes were fixed on Rusty, who paused to look at her as if urging her on. Whatever was in that grave, they were about to find out. The cemetery was a theater now, the mourners an audience, held captive by Rusty's mission. Tom, grumbling but curious, fetched a second shovel and began digging alongside the dog. The crowd pressed closer, their whispers a low hum. Margaret stood at the edge of the grave, her hands clasped tightly, the white rose now crushed in her grip. Clara clutched her arm. "This is madness, Maggie. Robert's gone. Let him rest." But Margaret shook her off. She'd spent a lifetime trusting Robert. Rusty was an extension of him. If the dog was this determined, there was something to find. The shovels struck wood with a dull thud. Tom and another groundskeeper cleared the last of the dirt, revealing the simple oak casket Robert had chosen. It was scratched but intact, the brass handles glinting in the grey light. Rusty stopped digging and sat back panting, his eyes fixed on the casket. The crowd held its breath. "Mrs. Ellison," Tom said, wiping sweat from his brow. "You sure about this? Once we open it, there's no going back." Margaret nodded, though her stomach churned. She wasn't sure, not really, but turning back felt like betraying Robert. "Do it," she said. Tom pried open the lid with a crowbar. The wood creaked in protest. The mourners leaned forward, some covering their mouths. Margaret braced herself, expecting the worst. But what they saw wasn't Robert, at least not just Robert. Nestled beside his body, wrapped in a plastic bag, was a small metal box, no bigger than a cigar case, rusted at the edges but sealed tight. Rusty whined softly, nudging the casket with his nose. Margaret's breath caught. Robert had never mentioned a box. "What is that?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Margaret said. But her mind raced. Robert had been meticulous, a man who planned everything. If he'd hidden this, it was deliberate. She reached for the box, her arthritis making her fingers clumsy. Tom handed it to her, his expression a mix of pity and intrigue. The crowd buzzed with questions. Was it money, a letter, something illegal? Margaret held the box. Its weight felt heavier than its size suggested. She looked at Rusty, who stared back, calm now, as if his job was done. "Open it, Maggie," Mr. Jenkins urged, his voice gentle but firm. Others nodded, their curiosity outweighing their discomfort. Margaret's hands shook as she fumbled with the latch. Whatever was inside, it was Robert's final message. And she wasn't sure she was ready to hear it. The metal box was cold in Margaret's hands, its surface pitted with rust, but solid like it had been forged for a purpose. The mourners crowded closer, their faces a mix of awe and apprehension. Margaret's heart thudded as she worked the latch, her fingers stiff with age and nerves. Rusty sat beside her, his eyes locked on the box, as if he understood its significance. The latch gave way with a faint click. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a small key, a folded letter, and a photograph. Margaret's breath hitched. The photograph showed a young Robert, barely 20, in his army uniform, standing beside another soldier, a man she didn't recognize. Both were smiling, but Robert's eyes held a sadness she'd seen only in his quiet moments. She unfolded the letter, the paper brittle but legible. Robert's handwriting, unmistakable, stared back at her. The crowd leaned in, but Margaret turned slightly, shielding the words. This was private for now. "Dear Maggie," the letter began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone. And Rusty's done his job. I'm sorry for keeping this from you. I never knew how to tell you about David." David. The name hit Margaret like a stone. Robert had mentioned a David once, years ago, a friend from Vietnam who died in combat. He'd clammed up after, refusing to share more. She'd assumed it was the war's pain, locked away like so many of his memories. The letter continued. "David Carter saved my life in '68, took a bullet meant for me. I promised to look after his family. But I failed. His sister Ellen lives in Maplewood. She doesn't know about me or this. The key is for a safety deposit box at First National. It holds something for her. Please, Maggie, find her. Make it right." Margaret's eyes stung. Robert had carried this guilt for decades, never breathing a word. She looked at the key, small and silver, its edges worn smooth. The photograph trembled in her hand as she studied the stranger, David, who'd shaped her husband's life. The crowd murmured, sensing the weight of the moment. Clara touched Margaret's shoulder. "What does it say, Maggie?" Margaret hesitated. This wasn't just her secret to share, but the mourners' faces, kind, familiar, weathered by their own losses, reminded her she wasn't alone. It's from Robert, she said softly. He left something for someone else. She looked at Rusty, who lay down beside the grave. His job complete. The mystery wasn't over. It was just beginning. Margaret clutched the letter as the mourners dispersed, their whispers trailing into the dusk. The cemetery felt quieter now, the weight of Robert's secret settling over her like a fog. Clara insisted on driving her home, but Margaret's mind was elsewhere. Who was Ellen Carter, and why had Robert hidden this from her for so long? At home, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, the metal box open before her, Rusty curled up at her feet. His warmth a small comfort. She reread the letter, searching for clues. Robert had written that Ellen lived in Maplewood, but Margaret had never heard the name. Maplewood was small, barely 5,000 people, but secrets could hide in plain sight. She called Mr. Jenkins, who'd known Robert since their school days. Ellen Carter? He mused over the phone. Can't say I know her, but there's an Ellen Price who runs the library. Widowed, keeps to herself. Could be her maiden name. The next morning, Margaret drove to the Maplewood Library, Rusty in the passenger seat. The library was a quaint brick building, its shelves lined with books Robert had loved. Ellen Price, a woman in her late 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes, stood behind the counter. Margaret's heart raced as she approached, the photograph and letter in her purse. "Excuse me," Margaret said, her voice unsteady. "Are you Ellen Carter?" Ellen's face tightened just for a moment. "Haven't been called that in years." "Who's asking?" Margaret explained, her words tumbling out. Robert's death, Rusty's digging, the letter. Ellen listened, her expression unreadable. When Margaret showed her the photograph, Ellen's hand shook as she touched her brother's face. "David," she whispered. "I haven't seen this picture in decades." Ellen invited Margaret to a quiet corner. She confirmed she was David Carter's sister, widowed 5 years ago, living alone. "Robert came to see me once in '70, she said. Said he owed David his life. Promised to help me if I ever needed it. I told him I was fine. Never heard from him again." Margaret handed her the key. "He left this for you. It's for a safety deposit box." Ellen stared at the key, her eyes glistening. "Why now?" she asked. "I don't know," Margaret admitted, "but Robert wanted you to have it." They agreed to visit First National Bank the next day. As Margaret drove home, Rusty's steady breathing beside her, she felt a mix of relief and unease. What was in that box? And why had Robert kept it from her? The First National Bank smelled of old paper and polished wood, a relic of Maplewood's past. Margaret and Ellen stood at the counter, the silver key glinting in Ellen's hand. Rusty waited outside, tied to a post, his eyes tracking Margaret through the glass door. The bank manager, a kindly woman named Susan, led them to the vault. Margaret's nerves buzzed. She'd spent the night replaying Robert's letter, wondering what he'd hidden. Ellen, too, seemed on edge, her fingers fidgeting with the key. "I never thought I'd hear from Robert again," she said softly. David talked about him in his letters, called him a brother. Susan unlocked the safety deposit box, number 472, and slid it onto a table. It was larger than Margaret expected, heavy with possibility. Ellen hesitated, then inserted the key. The lock clicked. The lid opened to reveal a stack of papers, a small velvet pouch, and a journal bound in worn leather. Ellen lifted the journal first, her hands trembling. It was Robert's, filled with entries from 1968 to 1970. Margaret recognized his tight, precise handwriting. Ellen read aloud a passage. "David's gone. I owe him everything. I'll make it right for him and Ellen." The papers were legal documents, savings bonds dated 1970, made out to Ellen Carter. The pouch held a gold locket, engraved with DC. Inside was a tiny photo of David and Ellen as children. Ellen's eyes welled up. "This was our mother's," she whispered. "David kept it in Vietnam." Margaret's throat tightened. Robert had saved these for Ellen, a promise kept across decades. But why hide it? The journal offered clues. Robert wrote of his guilt, his fear that Ellen would reject his help. Thinking it charity, he'd opened the box to deposit the bonds, planning to tell her one day, but never did. "There's more," Ellen said, pulling out a letter addressed to her. It was Robert's handwriting again, dated a month before his death. "Ellen, I failed you," it read. "I couldn't face you after David. These bonds are what I could save. Use them for something good. Forgive me. Ellen clutched the letter, tears falling. I never blamed him, she said. He didn't need to do this. Margaret felt a pang. Robert's secrecy had been his burden, not hers. She reached for Ellen's hand. He loved David, and he wanted you to be okay. As they left the bank, the bonds and locket in Ellen's purse, Margaret felt lighter. But one question lingered. Why had Rusty known? Back at Margaret's house, the two women sat at the kitchen table, the journal and locket between them. Rusty lay nearby, his head resting on Margaret's foot. Ellen traced the locket's engraving, her voice soft. David used to say, dogs know more than we think. I guess Rusty proved it. Margaret nodded, still puzzled. Rusty had always been intuitive, alerting Robert to seizures during his illness, sensing storms before they hit. But digging up a grave? That was something else. She flipped through Robert's journal, hoping for answers. One entry dated a year ago caught her eye. Took Rusty to the cemetery today. Showed him where I'll be. Told him to look after Maggie, to make sure she finds the box. He listened like he understood. Margaret's breath caught. Robert had trained Rusty somehow to lead her to the truth. She looked at the dog, his eyes calm but alert. You knew all along, didn't you? She whispered. Rusty thumped his tail as if in agreement. Ellen smiled faintly. David had a dog like that. Said it saved him in Vietnam once, sniffing out danger. Maybe Rusty's got some of that in him. Margaret thought of Robert's final days. He'd spent hours with Rusty, whispering to him when he thought she wasn't listening. She'd assumed it was delirium, but now it made sense. Robert had entrusted Rusty with his final mission. The bonds, Ellen revealed, were worth $50,000, enough to secure her future. She planned to donate part to the library in David's name. It's what he'd have wanted, she said. Margaret felt a swell of pride. Robert's promise, though delayed, would live on. But the story wasn't over. Word of Rusty's feat spread through Maplewood. Neighbors came to Margaret's door. Mr. Jenkins brought flowers, saying, Robert always said that dog was special. Others shared stories of Robert's kindness, fixing a neighbor's roof, tutoring kids for free. Margaret realized how much of her husband's heart she was still discovering. As the sun set, Margaret and Ellen sat on the porch, Rusty between them. You think they're watching us? Ellen asked, looking at the stars. Robert and David, Margaret said. I'd bet on it. Rusty lifted his head, letting out a soft bark, as if he agreed. Weeks later, Maplewood buzzed with talk of Rusty's miracle. The local paper ran a story, calling it the dog who dug up a secret. Margaret, usually private, let them print it. She wanted Robert's story told, not just his guilt, but his love, his loyalty, his quiet heroism. Ellen used the bonds to fund a reading program at the library, named after David. She and Margaret grew close, meeting weekly for tea, sharing memories of the men they'd loved. Rusty, ever present, seemed to approve, his tail wagging whenever Ellen arrived. Margaret found peace in the routine. She'd spent 50 years with Robert, but only now felt she truly knew him. His secrets weren't betrayals. They were his way of protecting her from his pain. She forgave him, just as Ellen had. One evening, Margaret walked Rusty to St. Mary's Cemetery. The grave was restored, a new headstone bearing Robert's name, and a small engraving of a German shepherd. She laid a white rose on the stone, her fingers lingering. You did good, Robert, she said. You and Rusty both. Rusty sat beside her, his gaze steady. Margaret smiled, feeling Robert's presence in the dog's quiet strength. She thought of her neighbors, her new friend Ellen, the community that had rallied around her. Grief had brought them together, but love had kept them there. As she walked home, the stars bright above, Margaret felt lighter than she had in years. Robert's legacy wasn't just in the bonds or the locket. It was in the connections he'd fostered, the lives he'd touched, the dog he'd trusted to carry his final wish. For the seniors of Maplewood, and for readers across the USA, UK, and Canada, this was a story of loyalty, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between a person and their pet. Rusty hadn't just dug up a box. He'd unearthed a truth that healed hearts and brought a community closer. And for Margaret, it was a reminder. Even in death, love finds a way to speak,